I received your letter by mistake, or at least that's what I believed when I first saw the envelope. Worn thin by time, the corners soft, the paper yellowed and delicate, as if it had waited too long to be opened and had grown tired in its silence. It was addressed to a name no one has used in this house for decades. A name that, like so many things from that part of my life, had been carefully stored away in a drawer of memory I no longer dared to open. I don't know what stopped me from tossing it into the bin like every other lost piece of mail that finds its way here by accident. Maybe it was the faint, familiar scent of dust and old paper that clung to it, or the strange weight of something inside that told me, somehow, that what I was holding wasn't junk, but a ghost. When I finally opened it, my hands already shaking more than I'd like to admit, I found a single photograph inside. Black and white, slightly faded, the edges curled from age, but the image itself still startlingly clear. Two young people stood side by side, arms around each other, smiling with the kind of quiet intensity that belongs only to those who know time is running out. They looked alive in a way I haven't felt in years. One of them was me. And in that instant, in the stillness of this quiet house, with the hum of the heater and the ticking of the old clock on the wall, something inside me unraveled. Because memories don't die, no matter how carefully you bury them. They wait, like embers under ash, ready to ignite with the smallest breath. I know my time is short. The nurses don't say it, but I can see it in their eyes, in the way they gently guide me down the hallway, in the way they pause before speaking, as if afraid their words might crack something fragile inside me. My body is no longer mine in the way it once was, and every day it betrays me a little more. But before it fails completely, before I fade into the silence that's been following me for decades, I need to tell you the truth. Because whether or not you were meant to send that letter to this address, and whether or not you expected a response, I need you to know that I am the man in that old photo. And this story, our story, is one no one ever dared to share with you, not because it was unworthy of telling, but because it was too full of pain, of fear, of all the things we never had the chance to say when the world was still on fire and time was something we thought we'd have more of. So if these words begin to stir something in you, if they carry even a fraction of the weight they held for me as I wrote them, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me. It helps us keep telling stories that speak to the things we all carry, the love we lost, the promises we broke, and the truths we never stop needing to hear. Because now, you need to prepare yourself. What comes next will change everything. It was the summer of 1944, and even though the war had reached every corner of the world, there were still days in upstate New York that felt untouched by it. Days when the sky was too blue, the air too soft, and the quiet too deep to belong to a country at war. I was back home on medical leave, recovering from an injury that left a scar on my shoulder, but a deeper one somewhere I couldn't see. Not on my skin, but somewhere quieter, somewhere inside. I'd been stationed in Italy with the Fifth Army, part of the Allied push through the Gustav Line, and I'd seen enough in those months to understand how fragile everything really was, how fast a man's entire life could collapse in a second, with nothing left but a dog tag and a letter someone else would have to send. But for those 2 weeks in Saratoga Springs, I tried to forget all that. I let myself breathe. That's when I met Ellie. She was volunteering as a nurse at the temporary clinic in the basement of the Methodist Church on Lincoln Avenue, where soldiers like me came for routine checkups, vaccinations, and bandage changes that sometimes felt more like ritual than necessity. She was 23, soft-spoken and sharp-eyed, with auburn hair she always tied back, and a voice that made everything sound a little more bearable. When she first looked at me, not at the bandage, not at the uniform, but at me, I felt something shift. I came back the next day pretending I'd forgotten something, just to hear her laugh again. We fell into a rhythm, as people do when time is short and feelings come faster than they should. We met in the mornings when she wasn't scheduled, wandered the trails around Saratoga Lake, drank sweet iced tea from glass bottles, and talked about things we weren't sure we'd ever have time to finish saying. She told me her father died in the Great War, buried somewhere in France, and how her mother raised her alone, ironing shirts for officers and dreaming of a world where peace might last longer than a generation. I told her I didn't think I'd live long enough to see that world. She didn't flinch. She never did. Our time together was quiet, borrowed, and impossibly full, like we were packing a lifetime into those 10 days. Because deep down, we both knew that time would never be on our side. I remember one afternoon when a summer storm rolled in off the lake, and we ran for cover under a gazebo, soaking wet and breathless. She looked at me like she was memorizing my face, not the way I looked, but the way I felt in that moment. Free, whole, young. And then the last day came. We borrowed her brother's camera, a Kodak Brownie, and walked down to the lake. It was overcast, the water silver and still, the air thick with the kind of quiet that settles in just before something ends. I wrapped my arm around her, pulled her close, and we smiled for the picture, the one you found, the one that came back to me in that envelope. It was the only photo we ever took together. Before we said goodbye, she pressed something into my hand. A silver locket, warm from her skin, with her name engraved on the back. Ellie. She didn't cry. She didn't beg me to stay. She just said, "Don't forget me." And I told her I wouldn't. I meant it. But war doesn't care about promises made beside lakes and under summer skies. War takes everything soft and bends it, bruises it, breaks it. I left 2 days later for a return transport to Naples. Locket tucked beneath my uniform, Ellie's name resting against my heart like a prayer I wasn't brave enough to speak aloud. On the train south, surrounded by boys trying to look like men, some of them still smelling of cologne and cigarette smoke, I stared out the window and tried to memorize the shape of that goodbye. The curve of her shoulders, the sound of her breath, the weight of a moment I'd never get back. I didn't know then that I'd already lost her. When I returned to the front, the world I'd briefly stepped out of had become darker, louder, and more hollow than I remembered. Italy was crumbling under the weight of history, the dead stacked higher than the rubble we fought through. Monte Cassino had fallen, and the path to Rome was open, but none of it felt like victory, not to those of us who had to march over what remained. I wore Ellie's locket every day. I kept it tucked beneath my undershirt, close to my chest, like armor that no enemy could touch. Not the snipers in the hills, not the mortars in the dark, not even the emptiness that creeps in when you lie awake at night, wondering whether the person you love is still thinking of you, or if they've already mourned you, or worse, forgotten you. War doesn't mark time like the world does. There are no weeks, no birthdays, no seasons. There is only before and after. You live in short bursts, a letter received, a friend lost, a moment of silence between shell fire. And in those bursts, you hold on to whatever you can. For me, it was Ellie, her name engraved in silver, her memory stitched into my heartbeat. When the war finally ended, I found myself not triumphant, not relieved, just lost. I was sent to a recovery camp near Oxford, England. It was supposed to be temporary, a few weeks to rest, regain strength, prepare for home. But I stayed longer than most. I couldn't face what came next. I didn't know where I belonged anymore, not in war and not yet in peace. And then, one morning, it came. A letter, folded neatly, no return address. The handwriting was familiar, careful, slanted, like someone trying to stay steady while the world shifted beneath them. It was Ellie. She wrote that she had given birth to a child. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't demand. She simply said she thought I should know, that a part of me was still alive even if I never returned. And then she signed her name the way she always had, just Ellie, with a small curve at the end of the E. I remember reading that letter in the barracks long after lights out. The others asleep around me, their breathing uneven. I read it again and again until the words began to blur. And then I folded it carefully and slipped it into the same book where I kept the photo. I never wrote back. Not because I didn't want to. I did. I even wrote the letter 12 times. Pages filled with apologies, with longing, with some attempt at a promise I could never make. But I never sent it. I convinced myself it was for the best. That she had her family. That the child would grow up without the burden of a father haunted by things no child should inherit. And in time, I let silence become the answer. I returned to the States in late 1946. I went to Boston first, then to Chicago, where I took a job as a mechanic, working long hours, keeping my head down. I rented a small room above a bakery. I didn't talk much, I didn't write letters, and I never told anyone about the locket I still wore beneath my shirt. Years passed like that. I met a woman, Ruth, in 52. She was kind and gentle with the kind of quiet resilience you only find in people who have lost something but choose to keep living anyway. We married in 54. I never told her about Ellie. I never told her about you. We tried for children. It never happened, and part of me wondered if it wasn't biology or timing or fate, but punishment. For the life I'd abandoned, for the silence I'd chosen. In 1956, I returned to Saratoga Springs. I told Ruth I was going to visit a friend from the war. But really, I was chasing a memory I'd never shaken loose. The house Ellie had lived in was gone, torn down, replaced by a supermarket and a row of brick apartments. I asked a local shop owner, an older man, if he remembered the family. He looked at me a long time before saying, "Yeah, she passed away a few years after the war. The baby, a boy I think, was raised by an aunt, quiet people, never talked much about the father." He said, "Father," like it was a question. But I knew the answer. That night, I drove to the edge of the lake. I parked near the spot where we took the photo. I sat there for hours, the locket warm in my palm, the night air thick with everything I never said. I thought of you, wondered how old you were, wondered if you'd ever been told about me, wondered if you'd hate me, and knew you'd have every right to. I didn't go back again. Some truths are too heavy to carry when you're alone, and back then, I didn't know how to ask for forgiveness. But the locket stayed with me. So did the photo. Folded inside my Bible, tucked between Psalm 51 and a prayer I could never bring myself to finish. And through the years, the decades, I wondered if somehow, someday, the story I buried might find its way back to you. I'd grown used to the quiet, not the peaceful kind that comes with comfort or the soft hush of a well-earned rest. No, this was the kind of quiet that settles over you like a second skin, born not from peace, but from absence. It was the silence of things unsaid, of letters never sent, of names not spoken aloud for decades. By the time I reached my late 80s, I lived alone in a modest apartment on the coast of Maine, surrounded by routine and shadows. Ruth had passed 10 years earlier. We'd had a gentle marriage, a quiet companionship marked by evening walks, folded laundry, and the kind of conversation that rarely digs deeper than the surface. She never asked too much about my past, and I never offered it. I told myself that was love too, protecting her from the ghosts I carried. But now, looking back, I see it for what it was, cowardice dressed as care. And then, just last week, everything changed. It was a Thursday afternoon. Rain fell soft against the window, the kind that taps politely, as if asking to come inside. I was reading the newspaper, or pretending to, when the doorbell rang. A small, padded envelope lay on the front mat. No return address, my name written in careful block letters. I opened it with trembling fingers, not because I suspected what was inside, but because my hands no longer move with the confidence they once had. I peeled the seal back slowly, and when I reached in, I felt the familiar resistance of old photo paper. I pulled it out, and I froze. It was the same photo, our photo. Me and Ellie standing by Saratoga Lake, her smile framed by the soft curve of my arm, my eyes squinting against the fading light of a day that still lived inside me. Except this time, I hadn't pulled it from my prayer book. Someone else had sent it. On the back, written in neat, steady handwriting, not Ellie's, not mine, was a single line. My mother always said he was a hero. Is he still alive? For a moment I forgot how to breathe. The words didn't feel like a question. They felt like an echo, like something I'd been waiting to hear for so long that I no longer believed it would come. I read them again, then again. I traced each letter with my finger, trying to imagine the hand that wrote them. Were you nervous? Did you hesitate before putting pen to paper? Did you wonder what you would find, or who? And how did you find me? Did you go through old boxes in an attic, chasing a memory someone else tried to bury? Did you stumble across the photograph in a drawer, pressed between faded linens and church bulletins? Or did your mother, my Ellie, leave it for you quietly, without explanation, hoping that someday, somehow, you'd be brave enough to follow it? I sat with that photograph for hours. I didn't cry, not at first, but something inside me, something I'd locked away so tightly I forgot where I put the key, began to shift. And when the first tear fell, I let it. Not for the pain, but for the possibility. Because even after all these years, after all the silence and shame and distance, this photo had come back to me, carried by your hands. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't dared believe in decades. You remembered, or maybe you never even knew but wanted to. I kept the envelope on the table beside my bed. The photo went back into the prayer book, this time not to hide it, but to hold it close. I reread your note every morning, not because the words change, but because I do. With each reading, I become less afraid. Ellie once told me in a whisper I'll never forget that love doesn't die, it just waits. I didn't understand what she meant until now. Because this letter, this photo, this question you dared to send, it's love, not the kind shouted across battlefields or carved into tree trunks, but the quiet kind, the kind that finds its way back even after all the roads have been closed. And if you've come this far, and if you're reading this now, then you deserve more than memories. You deserve the truth. Yes, I am your father. I don't know how that sounds when you read it, whether it lands with weight or disbelief, whether it cuts deep or simply passes over you like wind through trees you no longer notice. But I have written and rewritten that sentence in my mind for decades, whispering it to myself in dark rooms, mouthing it silently while staring at the ceiling in the middle of the night. And now, finally, I'm writing it to you, the only person in the world who deserves to hear it, and the only one I've ever been too afraid to say it to. I am your father, but not the kind that stories are built around. Not the man who taught you to ride a bike or sat on the edge of your bed telling bedtime tales about brave soldiers and good endings. I was not there when you took your first steps. I did not hold you when you cried. I missed the birthdays, the scraped knees, the questions only a child can ask and only a parent can answer. I missed your entire childhood, and for that I carry a weight I will never fully set down. I want you to know that it wasn't because I didn't care. It wasn't because I didn't love you. It was because I was afraid that I didn't know how to be the man you needed, afraid that the war had taken too much of me, that I no longer had anything worth offering. I thought I could protect you by staying away, that I could protect myself from seeing what I had already lost. But that was a lie, a quiet one. The kind you tell yourself so many times it becomes a truth you live inside. The truth is, I thought about you every day. I imagined what your voice might sound like. I wondered if you had Ellie's laugh, or her eyes, or the same stubborn streak that made her challenge every word I ever spoke. I pictured you walking through a world that had already hurt you before you even knew its name, and I hoped, selfishly, that maybe you'd forgive the man who disappeared before you ever had the chance to know him. You have every right to hate me, every right to ignore this letter, to tear it in half, to throw it into the wind and let the pieces scatter like everything I failed to hold on to. But before you do, please hear me when I say, you were never forgotten. You were never unwanted, you were never unloved. Even in silence, even in absence, even across oceans and decades, I carried you with me. Your mother, Ellie, she was the only woman I ever truly loved. I tried to move on. I tried to build a life, but no one else ever felt like home. And you are the only thing that ever felt like redemption, even if I was too much of a coward to reach for it until now. I don't know what kind of life you've lived. I don't know if you were happy, or if you've spent your life wondering why a father's arms never found you. But if this letter does anything, if these words find a place to land, let it be this: I am sorry. I'm more sorry than words can stretch to hold. I can't go back. I can't unmake the silence, but I can tell you the truth now. And if somewhere inside you there is even the faintest wish to know me, to speak, to ask, to sit face to face and decide for yourself what kind of man I am, then know that I am here. I will be here until the very end. I still wear the locket Ellie gave me. I still keep the photo you sent in the drawer beside my bed. And every night since it arrived, I've closed my eyes and wondered what your voice would sound like if you called me Dad. I don't know if that moment will ever come. But I needed you to know that it could, that the door is open, that I'm no longer hiding, because you are not just a memory. You are my son, or my daughter. You are the one thing that war could not destroy, and the only thing I've ever truly regretted losing. I live now in a nursing home just outside Portland, Maine. A quiet place surrounded by pine trees and the soft smell of ocean air that drifts through the windows in the mornings. My room is small, but enough. There's a bookshelf beside the bed, a wooden chair by the window, and a photo of Ruth, smiling, kind, long gone now, that keeps me company on the nights when sleep is slow to come. Most days are quiet, the kind of quiet that settles into your bones, not because of peace, but because so much has already been said or left unsaid, that there's nothing left but memory. I wake early. I drink my coffee slowly. The nurses are kind. They remind me gently when I forget things, and they let me sit outside when the weather allows, under a sugar maple that turns gold every fall. It's under that tree where I write this now, with the locket still around my neck and your photo folded neatly beside me. I don't know if you'll come. I don't know if these words will reach you in time, if they'll land in a place soft enough to hold them, or if they'll fall flat, too late, too heavy, too far removed from the life you've built without me. But I hope, more than I've hoped for anything in years, that you might read this not as a confession, but as a gift, a flawed one perhaps, an incomplete one, but a gift nonetheless. You didn't ask for this story. You didn't choose the silence that filled the space where I should have been, but now you have the truth. You are not a question without an answer. You are not a child without a father. You are not alone in wondering. I have wondered too. I've wondered what kind of person you became, what your laugh sounds like. Whether you still go walking by lakes in late summer, whether you've ever stared at an old photo and felt something stir in you, something deep, ancient, inexplicable, without knowing why. I've wondered if you've forgiven me already, or if you never even knew there was something to forgive. If you choose to come, if you ever want to meet the man behind the silence, I will be here. I sit beneath the maple tree most mornings. The nurses know where to find me. I may not move as fast as I used to, but I'm still here, still breathing, still waiting. And if you don't come, if the silence feels safer, then I understand. But keep this letter. Keep it in a drawer or a book or wherever you store the things that almost mattered. Because one day, when you look at that old photograph again, I want you to remember this: that man, the young soldier with the uncertain smile and the girl he couldn't forget. He didn't vanish. He lived. He loved. And even in the quiet, he never stopped hoping. Because I am the man in that old photo, and you deserve to know. We share stories like this every day. Real voices, real hearts, real life. Subscribe to our channel if you want to hear more stories that move and inspire.